between my money, bitch ass like these folks. I wanna be saved, something like Neo. I hate you, bitch like zero. People don't dance no more, I like those this zero. Ain't tricking if you dirty, but bitch you getting zero. Ain't help you with your rent and I can't help you with your car, no. Big when you get it, bitch, don't ask me for the car, bro, my girl. You should've kept the street playing games with my head when you knowing you are free. Knowing you the really living baby roach off. Say
This bitch got me pissed off.
but I ain't mad at your dog ass.
Your dog ass.
You down bad.
With your dog ass.
I'm sick and tired of these Range Rover hoes.
The early morning hours of June 7th, 2022 should have been peaceful. Inside a modest home on Fleetwood Drive in Jackson, Mississippi, 26-year-old Terania Jackson lay sleeping beside her boyfriend. The neighborhood was silent. The house was still, but someone was already inside. Zarian Brent, Terania's ex-boyfriend, had forced his way into her home with a gun in his hand and rage in his heart. He moved through the darkness with one purpose: to destroy the life she was trying to rebuild without him. Within seconds, gunfire shattered the silence. Terania was shot multiple times while lying in her own bed. She never had a chance to run, to scream, or to protect herself. By the time first responders arrived, she was gone. This was not random violence. This was not a stranger in the night. This was personal. On that June morning, Terania Leandria Jackson's life ended at the hands of a man who once claimed to love her. Her death exposed the terrifying consequences when obsession overtakes reason, when jealousy turns lethal, and when the warning signs go unnoticed until it's too late. But who was Terania Jackson beyond the headlines of her tragic death? To understand the full weight of this loss, we must first know the woman whose life was stolen that morning. Born on May 12, 1996 in Jackson, Mississippi, Terania grew up surrounded by family. As the second of 8 children, she experienced life within a close-knit family structure that valued togetherness, faith, and community support. Her early years were marked by active participation in her local church, where the foundations of her character, responsibility, compassion, and dedication to others took shape. Terania's journey led her through Provini High School in her hometown. While not defined by academic accolades, her schooling provided her with practical knowledge and social connections that would serve her throughout her short life. Former classmates describe a young woman who moved through the halls with quiet confidence, someone who didn't seek the spotlight, but whose presence was nonetheless felt. After completing high school, Terania found her professional place at UPS. Her position there wasn't just employment. It was evidence of her reliability and commitment. Coworkers note that she rarely missed a shift and approached her responsibilities with dedication. This job provided the financial stability she needed as a young mother, enabling her to create a life for herself and her daughter. The bond between Terania and her daughter stood at the center of her world. Friends and family consistently mention how her eyes would light up when speaking about her child. She approached motherhood with intention, working to create opportunities her daughter might not otherwise have had. Whether reading together before bed, teaching her family recipes passed down for generations, or simply spending quiet moments together, Terania embodied devoted motherhood. Everything Terania did was for that little girl. Her mother would later tell investigators. Every extra shift, every sacrifice, it was all to give her daughter a good life. But Terania's story also included complications. Her previous relationship with Zarian Brent had ended, and she had moved forward with a new partner, a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. Beyond her roles as employee and mother, Terania Jackson was known for her authentic joy in life's simple pleasures. She loved to travel, not necessarily to exotic destinations, but to places where she could create memories with the people she cherished most. Shopping trips became adventures, and family gatherings transformed into celebrations under her influence. Her laughter, described by many as infectious, could change the atmosphere of a room in an instant. Despite the financial constraints that many young single mothers face, Terania approached life with resourcefulness rather than resentment. She found ways to create special moments without extravagance, teaching those around her that meaningful experiences don't require wealth. A day at the park with her daughter held the same value as any expensive outing. A home-cooked meal shared with family meant more than any restaurant reservation ever could. Her faith remained a guiding force throughout her adult life, just as it had been during her childhood. The values instilled in her through years of church attendance, compassion, forgiveness, perseverance, shaped how she moved through the world. When times were difficult, she leaned on her beliefs for strength. When blessings came her way, she expressed gratitude. Friends recall her speaking about being one of God's beautiful creations, a reflection of the confidence she carried in her identity and purpose. Terenia's social circle was small but meaningful. She wasn't someone who needed dozens of acquaintances to feel fulfilled. Instead, she cultivated deep connections with people who truly mattered. Her friends knew they could depend on her, whether they needed a listening ear, practical help, or simply someone to share a laugh with during hard times. She showed up for the people she loved, and they showed up for her in return. At work, her colleagues at UPS appreciated her consistency and positive attitude. She didn't complain about early shifts or overtime hours. She understood that every paycheck represented security for her daughter, and that motivation kept her focused. Her supervisors noted her punctuality and willingness to help wherever needed. She wasn't chasing promotions or accolades. She was building a stable foundation, one shift at a time. This stability extended into her vision for the future. Terenia talked about wanting to give her daughter opportunities she herself hadn't always had. She spoke of saving money, of planning ahead, of creating a life where her child wouldn't have to worry or struggle the way she sometimes had. She wasn't waiting for someone else to rescue her or provide for her family. She was doing the work herself, step by step, day by day. In her personal life, Terenia had begun to embrace the possibility of new love. After her relationship with Zarian Brent ended, she eventually allowed herself to open up to someone new. She kept this part of her life relatively private, sharing moments with her new partner away from public scrutiny or social media drama. It was a fresh start, a chance to experience companionship without the complications that had marked her previous engagement. Those closest to her noticed the shift. She seemed lighter, more hopeful. The weight of a difficult past relationship had lifted, and she was beginning to envision a future that included partnership alongside motherhood and career. She deserved that hope. She deserved the chance to build something healthy and supportive. But while Terenia was moving forward with intention and optimism, someone from her past was moving in a very different direction. The relationship she had left behind was not as finished as she believed. The man she had once planned to marry had not accepted the end of their engagement the way she had. And while she focused on her daughter, her job, and her new relationship, warning signs were forming in the background, signs that would soon become impossible to ignore. Terenia Jackson was building a life worth living. She was not struggling or spiraling. She was thriving in the ways that mattered most to her. She was present for her daughter, reliable at her job, connected to her family, and open to love. Her story was supposed to continue unfolding with all the ordinary beauty of a young woman coming into her own. But Terenia was moving forward, and her past wasn't finished with her. Zarian Brent had once been part of Terenia Jackson's vision for the future. Their relationship had progressed to engagement, a commitment that suggested shared dreams, mutual trust, and plans for a life built together. For a time, they were a couple working toward something permanent, something that extended beyond the present moment into years ahead. But relationships that begin with promise don't always end with fulfillment. Over time, cracks appeared in the foundation they had attempted to build. Whatever hope had once existed between them eventually crumbled under the weight of incompatibility, unmet expectations, or fundamental differences that couldn't be reconciled. The engagement ended, and with it, the future they had imagined together. For Terenia, the breakup represented a difficult but necessary closure. She did what many people do when a significant relationship ends. She grieved, she processed, and she moved forward. She didn't broadcast her pain on social media or seek public sympathy. She handled the separation with the same quiet dignity that characterized most aspects of her life. She focused on her daughter, her work, and her own healing. In time, she opened herself to the possibility of new love, entering a relationship that brought her joy without the complications of her past. This is how healthy separation works. Both parties acknowledge that the relationship has run its course, and they release each other to pursue separate paths. Pain exists, certainly, but so does acceptance. The door closes, and both people eventually walk through different ones. But Zari and Brent did not walk through a different door. For him, the end of their engagement was not an accepted reality, but an ongoing problem to be solved. While Terania moved forward, Brent remained anchored in what had been. His inability to accept the separation manifested not in dramatic confrontations or public scenes, but in persistent, escalating contact that blurred the line between attachment and obsession. Phone records from the months following their breakup told a story that contradicted the notion of a clean separation. Calls and messages continued with troubling frequency. While Terania attempted to establish boundaries and create distance, Brent found ways to maintain connection. His presence in her life was not violent in the traditional sense. There were no documented assaults, no restraining orders, no police reports that would have flagged him as a clear and present danger. This absence of official documentation is critical to understand. The narrative that domestic violence must include visible bruises or formal legal complaints is dangerously incomplete. Control can exist without physical contact. Obsession can grow without ever producing evidence that would satisfy a courtroom. The lack of abuse reports does not equal the absence of danger. It often simply means the danger hasn't yet taken its most devastating form. Those close to Terania noticed the pattern, but struggled to articulate the threat. Brent's behavior could be explained away as the actions of someone having difficulty letting go, persistent but not necessarily dangerous. Repeated calls could be dismissed as emotional processing rather than boundary violations. His refusal to accept the relationship's end could be framed as heartbreak rather than control. But control it was. What appeared on the surface as attachment was actually an inability to accept Terania's autonomy, her right to choose a different path, her decision to build a life that didn't include him. When someone cannot respect another person's choice to leave, they are demonstrating a fundamental belief that their desires supersede that person's freedom. This belief system doesn't end with acceptance. It escalates until something breaks. Adding to the complexity of the situation was Brent's history with firearms. While specific details of his prior legal concerns would later become crucial to investigators, what mattered in real time was that he had access to weapons and a growing inability to cope with rejection. These two factors, obsession and access to lethal means, create a combination that domestic violence experts recognize as exceptionally dangerous. Yet none of this produced the kind of warning that would have mobilized intervention. There was no moment dramatic enough to trigger protective measures. No single incident that crossed the threshold into obvious criminality. Just a pattern, a slow accumulation of boundary violations, unwanted contact, and emotional pressure that Terania navigated while trying to maintain her forward momentum. She was building a new life. She had found happiness with someone else. She was protecting her daughter and focusing on the future. She had done everything right in terms of moving on from a relationship that no longer served her. But moving on requires that both people accept the ending. And Zari and Brent had not accepted anything. Sometimes the most dangerous violence grows quietly, invisible until the moment it destroys everything in its path. The pre-dawn hours of June 7th, 2025, should have been unremarkable. In homes across Jackson, Mississippi, people slept through the final moments of night, unaware that daylight would soon bring routine and responsibility. Inside Terania Jackson's residence, the world was still and quiet. She lay sleeping beside her boyfriend, both unaware that someone had already made the decision to end her life. There was no argument that morning. No heated phone call that escalated into threats. No warning text message or confrontation that might have provided even seconds of preparation. The violence that was about to unfold had not been provoked by anything Terania said or did in those final hours. The decision had already been made, likely days or even weeks before. What remained was simply execution. Zari and Brent did not knock. He did not announce himself or create an opportunity for conversation. He forced his way into Terania's home with the clarity of someone who had already moved past hesitation into action. This was not a crime of passion in the way that phrase is sometimes misunderstood, a sudden, uncontrollable emotional explosion. This was premeditated violence carried out by someone who had armed himself, traveled to her residence, and prepared to kill. He carried a firearm. He moved through the home with purpose, not confusion. His path led directly to the bedroom, where Terania slept alongside the man she had chosen to be with, the man who represented her future instead of her past. For Brent, the sight of them together may have confirmed what he already knew, but could not accept, that Terania had truly moved on, that her life no longer included him, that his refusal to accept their separation had not changed her reality. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but would reverberate through countless lives for years to come. Brent opened fire. The shots came at close range, eliminating any possibility of escape or defense. Multiple rounds were fired in rapid succession. Terania was struck repeatedly, her body absorbing the bullets that Brent had intended to end her life. There was no chance to run, no opportunity to plead, no moment where words might have changed the outcome. The violence was immediate and overwhelming. Her boyfriend was also shot during the attack. He would survive his injuries, but in those chaotic moments, survival was uncertain for both of them. He attempted to help Terania even as his own body processed the trauma of being hit. The scene became one of blood, panic, and the desperate instinct to preserve life in the face of death. Brent did not stay. Having delivered the violence he came to inflict, he fled the residence, leaving behind two people fighting for their lives, and a home transformed into a crime scene. His departure was as purposeful as his arrival. He had accomplished what he set out to do, and remaining would serve no purpose. The first 911 call came quickly. Emergency responders rushed to the address, arriving to find a scene of catastrophic violence. Paramedics worked to stabilize both victims, their training taking over even as the emotional weight of what they witnessed settled into their consciousness. They had seen gunshot wounds before. Jackson, like many American cities, was no stranger to gun violence. But the particularity of this scene, the intimacy of the bedroom setting, the clear evidence of targeted execution, made it impossible to approach with detachment. Terania Jackson received immediate medical attention. Responders did everything within their power and training to preserve her life. They fought against the damage that multiple gunshots at close range had inflicted on her body. They worked with the urgency that every victim deserves, recognizing that behind the clinical reality of wounds and vital signs was a 29-year-old woman whose life still held infinite value. But some damage cannot be undone. Some violence is too severe for even the most skilled intervention to overcome. Despite every effort, Terania Jackson was pronounced dead. The woman who had spent the previous day living her ordinary life, working, caring for her daughter, existing in the world as someone with plans and purpose, was gone. A mother was dead. A daughter would grow up without the woman who had centered her entire existence around providing love and opportunity. A family had lost a cherished member. Friends would never again hear her laughter or benefit from her presence. The community had lost another young black woman to male violence, adding Terania's name to a list that grows longer every year. Her boyfriend, wounded but alive, would carry the physical and psychological scars of that morning for the rest of his life. He had survived, but survival in the context of such targeted violence comes with its own forms of devastation. He had witnessed the woman he cared about being killed in front of him. He had been powerless to prevent it. The sun rose over Jackson that morning, indifferent to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Inside Terania's home, investigators would soon begin the meticulous work of documenting evidence, taking photographs, and building the case against the man who had stolen her future. But the violence didn't end with the gunshots. Within hours of Terania Jackson's murder, detectives from the Jackson Police Department began piecing together what had happened inside her home. The crime scene told a clear story. This was not a random act of violence, not a burglary gone wrong, not a case of mistaken identity. Every piece of evidence pointed toward a targeted attack carried out by someone who knew exactly where Terania lived, who she was with, and when she would be most vulnerable. Forensic indicators supported what investigators already suspected based on the circumstances. The forced entry, the direct path to the bedroom, the multiple shots fired at close range, These were not the actions of someone operating on impulse or caught up in an unplanned confrontation. This was premeditated murder, executed with the kind of cold calculation that distinguishes assassination from spontaneous violence. The boyfriend's testimony provided crucial confirmation. Despite his own injuries and the psychological trauma of watching someone he cared about be killed in front of him, he was able to give investigators critical information. He identified the shooter. He described what had happened in those horrific moments. His eyewitness account transformed the investigation from theory into certainty. Zarian Brent was named as the prime suspect. A citywide manhunt began immediately. Law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to locate and apprehend a man now considered armed and extremely dangerous. Detectives worked to track his movements, identify potential locations where he might seek refuge, and alert surrounding jurisdictions that Brent was on the run. The urgency was palpable. Every hour he remained free represented both a public safety threat and a diminishing chance of swift accountability. For 2 days, Brent evaded capture. In a city the size of Jackson, with its complex network of neighborhoods, highways, and potential hiding places, disappearing is possible for someone with sufficient desperation and assistance. Investigators pursued leads, followed tips from the community, and maintained pressure on anyone who might have information about his whereabouts. But manhunts are not solely about finding the fugitive. They're also about understanding the support system that enables evasion. And it was here that the investigation took an unexpected turn, revealing a dimension of the crime that extended beyond the shooter himself. Vita Valentine, also known as Vida Valentine, was identified as having provided assistance to Brent following the murder. While Brent pulled the trigger, Valentine allegedly helped him remain free in the critical hours and days after Terenia's death. Her assistance took forms that are common in cases where fugitives attempt to evade law enforcement: transportation that allowed him to move between locations without being spotted, shelter that kept him hidden from public view, and support that extended the manhunt beyond what it might have been had Brent been forced to navigate his escape alone. The revelation of Valentine's involvement added a layer of complexity to the case. She had not been present during the murder itself. She had not fired a weapon or participated in the violence that ended Terenia's life. But her actions after the fact demonstrated a willingness to protect someone who had just committed murder, to actively obstruct justice, and to prioritize Brent's freedom over accountability for Terenia's death. Prosecutors filed charges against Valentine for accessory after the fact, a crime that recognizes the serious nature of helping a murderer evade arrest. The charge acknowledged that violence doesn't end with the person who pulls the trigger. Those who enable, assist, and protect killers become part of the machinery that denies victims justice and leaves families without closure. On June 9, 2025, 2 days after Terenia Jackson was killed, the manhunt ended. The U.S. Marshals Task Force, working in coordination with local law enforcement, successfully located and arrested Zarian Brent. The apprehension was the result of coordinated investigative work, community cooperation, and the kind of relentless pressure that eventually eliminates options for fugitives. Brent was charged with capital murder and aggravated assault. The capital murder charge reflected the premeditated nature of Terenia's killing and the aggravating circumstances that made this more than a standard homicide. The aggravated assault charge addressed the attack on her boyfriend, who had survived but would carry the physical and emotional scars of that morning indefinitely. Bond was denied. Brent would remain in custody as the case moved through the judicial system. For investigators and prosecutors, this decision was appropriate given the severity of the charges and the demonstrated willingness to use lethal violence. For Terenia's family, it represented a small measure of security. The man who had killed their daughter would not be walking free while awaiting trial. The community's reaction was immediate and multifaceted. Grief for Terenia mixed with anger at the violence that had taken her life. Relief that the suspect was in custody existed alongside frustration that another young black woman had been killed by an intimate partner. Conversations about domestic violence, gun access, and the warning signs that too often go unrecognized spread through social media, churches, and neighborhood gatherings. Terenia's story became part of a larger, ongoing conversation about intimate partner violence and the particular vulnerability of black women who are killed by current or former partners at rates that exceed other demographic groups. Advocacy organizations pointed to her case as yet another example of how the absence of formal abuse reports doesn't mean the absence of danger, how obsession and rejection can turn deadly, and how the legal system too often responds only after violence has already destroyed lives. Vigils were held. Social media posts commemorated Tarinia's life while demanding justice for her death. Her daughter, too young to fully comprehend the permanence of what had happened, was now part of a tragic sisterhood. Children who lose mothers to intimate partner violence, left to grow up with absence where presence should have been. The arrests of both Brent and Valentine marked a transition in the case from manhunt to legal proceedings. Evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify, and the criminal justice system would work through the process of determining guilt and assigning punishment. Justice was beginning, but healing was not. The courtroom proceedings that followed Zari and Brent's arrest transformed private grief into public record. What had been a family's unspeakable loss became evidence cataloged, testimonies delivered, and legal arguments constructed. The prosecution methodically built its case, presenting the physical and testimonial evidence that documented not just what happened on June 7, 2025, but why. Ballistics reports confirmed that the bullets recovered from the scene matched the firearm linked to Brent. The trajectory analysis supported eyewitness testimony about positioning and intent. The timeline established through phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements painted a picture of premeditation. A man who armed himself, traveled to Tarinia's home, forced entry, and executed a plan he had likely been formulating for days or weeks. The prosecution's argument centered on jealousy and possessiveness as motive. They presented evidence of Brent's inability to accept the end of his relationship with Tarinia, his escalating contact, despite her attempts to establish boundaries, and his ultimate decision that if he could not have her, no one would. This narrative, tragically common in intimate partner homicides, illustrated how rejection can transform into lethal violence when combined with access to weapons and a belief system that prioritizes control over respect. The defense attempted to challenge the prosecution's characterization of intent, seeking to introduce doubt or mitigating circumstances that might reduce the severity of charges or potential sentencing. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forced entry eliminated any claim of accidental confrontation. The multiple shots at close range contradicted any suggestion of warning or hesitation. The flight from the scene demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Tarinia's family attended court proceedings, their presence a silent testament to the human cost behind the legal process. Her mother sat through testimony that described her daughter's final moments in clinical detail. She listened to arguments that reduced a vibrant life to evidence and exhibits. She witnessed the man who had killed her child, sitting mere feet away, the physical manifestation of grief that would never fully leave her. When given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements, family members spoke of the Tarinia the courtroom would never know. Not the victim in the photographs, but the living woman whose absence created a void that could never be filled. They spoke of her daughter, who would grow up with photographs instead of memories, stories instead of experiences, and questions about a mother she would barely remember. The emotional toll of Tarinia's murder extended far beyond the courtroom. Her daughter faced a childhood fundamentally altered by violence she had no power to prevent or understand. Grandparents who should have been enjoying watching their grandchild grow now carried the additional responsibility of filling an unfillable space. Friends mourned not just the loss of Tarinia, but the loss of who she would have become, the milestone she would have celebrated, the contribution she would have made to her community. Community response manifested in memorials, vigils, and ongoing conversations about intimate partner violence. Tarinia's story resonated because it wasn't unique. It reflected patterns that claim lives across demographics and circumstances. The specifics varied, but the underlying dynamics remain consistent. A relationship that ends, a refusal to accept that ending, an escalation of controlling behavior, and ultimately, lethal violence. Public outrage focused not just on Brent's individual actions, but on systemic failures that allow such violence to continue. Advocates pointed to the reality that Tarinia had done everything right. She had left an unhealthy relationship, focused on building her own life, and attempted to move forward. Yet she still died because her ex-partner had access to a firearm, because obsession was dismissed as heartbreak, because warning signs were normalized rather than recognized as precursors to violence. The case highlighted how obsession is often mistaken for love, particularly in narratives that romanticize persistence and refuse to accept no as a complete answer. Brent's inability to let go was not devotion, it was control. His continued contact was not evidence of deep feeling. It was violation of boundaries. His ultimate decision to kill rather than allow Terania to live her own life was not passion. It was murderous entitlement. Gun access emerged as a critical factor in discussions about prevention. Brent's prior history with firearms had raised concerns, but had not resulted in restrictions that might have prevented him from accessing the weapon used to kill Terania. Advocates argued for stronger enforcement of existing laws that prohibit domestic abusers from possessing firearms, along with expanded definitions of what constitutes domestic violence for the purposes of such restrictions. Throughout all the legal proceedings, media coverage, and public discussion, one truth remained central. Terania Jackson was more than a victim. She was a daughter who brought joy to her mother's life. She was a mother whose entire world revolved around her child's well-being. She was an employee who showed up reliably and contributed meaningfully to her workplace. She was a friend who offered support, laughter, and genuine connection. She was a young woman with dreams, plans, and a future that should have unfolded over decades. Her life mattered, not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. The hours she spent reading to her daughter, the extra shifts she worked to provide stability, the quiet moments of joy she created for herself and others. These are what defined her existence, not the violence that ended it. Telling Terania's story serves multiple purposes. It honors her memory by ensuring she is not reduced to a statistic or forgotten as time passes. It provides education about the warning signs of dangerous relationships and the reality that leaving is often the most dangerous time for victims of intimate partner violence. It challenges communities to take obsessive behavior seriously rather than dismissing it as harmless persistence. Awareness saves lives. Red flags must be taken seriously. Boundaries must be respected. And the narrative that equates possessiveness with love must be actively challenged and dismantled. Terania Jackson should still be here, raising her daughter, working toward her goals, living the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a human life. She isn't, because someone decided his inability to accept rejection justified taking everything from her. Telling her story ensures she is never forgotten.